One of the big attractions of satellite television, both for BSB and for Sky, was the newfangled idea of a movie channel. Both teams were promising one, Sky with Sky Movies and BSB with what was still provisionally named Screen. Star Wars and the birth of VHS had given rise to the age of the blockbuster. Tim Burton's inescapable Batman was just around the corner. The chance to see the biggest movies on the planet without having to wait for 3 years for ITV or the BBC to bother showing it was the most potent bait any new broadcaster could possibly hold, VHS notwithstanding. And so both BSB and Sky attempted to snuggle up to the major Hollywood studios in hopes of striking a deal to broadcast their productions. While the rest of the country was sweating through the second summer of love, for BSB and Sky, 1988 was to be the summer of the movie wars. As with so much else, BSB had been acting relatively leisurely about this, under the impression that as a monopoly they had the time. Then suddenly, Murdoch. When he and Sky arrived on the scene, BSB were on the point, according to them, of signing deals with 4 of the big 7 studios at the time: Paramount, Columbia, Universal and MGM UA. The key phrase there, of course, is "on the point of," as opposed to about to actually do so. Hollywood wasn't sure to make of these new guys from across the Atlantic, especially with satellite television having failed to make any impression whatsoever in America, where cable turned out to be much more practical. As BSB were learning, satellite broadcasting was ball-dryingly expensive. And they were just trying to set up in Britain, really quite a small country. The sheer size of the US made full-scale satellite broadcasting almost too expensive to bother with, at least at this point, particularly with standard cable already established as the American viewer's luxury of choice. With that in mind, Tinseltown was reticent when it came to striking deals with these limey space race startups. There was no guarantee that either service would last long enough to justify the effort or cash. Besides, they already had perfectly serviceable deals with the extant terrestrial television channels. In fact, the old guard were giving everyone involved a headache by threatening to withdraw or restrict their business with the studios if they made a deal with BSB they didn't like. At least that was the rumour. The channels involved naturally denied any such intention, and to be fair, it would have been the single greatest act of cutting one's nose off to spite their face prior to the rise of Nick Clegg, or the EU referendum. Either way, the Hollywood studios weren't overly worried at this point. As long as the price was right, there was no reason not to sell. Besides, they blatantly held all the cards. These were their movies and theirs alone. They could demand almost any amount of cash they could comfortably conceive out of BSB, or indeed Sky when they came knocking. What was really holding negotiations up was the second front, the video market.
Nice of you to drop in, love.
Oh, and you've missed your football on TV.
Anything for you, Mum.
Oh, you are a good boy.
Bye.
When you have a Philips television recorder, you don't have to miss anything. The Philips television recorder records TV when you can't watch.
Home video had changed the world, naturally, but it's often forgotten just how fundamental that change was. Before VHS and to a lesser extent Betamax came along, movies were special magical things like unicorns. Unless you owned a cinema or were controller of BBC One, you had little or no power over what films you got to see or when. And if you missed it, it was tough luck, because there was as yet no way to save the pictures on the telly box for viewing again and again. Television was inherently ephemeral. And then video technology became available to the proles, and the home entertainment game changed on a fundamental level.
Now you can own the magic of Disney on video. A classic library can be yours to share forever. Bring Disney home for keeps.
Notice the prominent use of the word own it, on VHS. That was the astonishing concept that home video had made a reality. You could own a movie, or more accurately, a copy of one, for your very own, to watch over and over again until either you or the tape died, whichever came first, usually the latter. As the central focus and main selling point of BSB, Screen was the first of BSB's channels to gain a controller. The late Andy Birchall had in fact been the 5th employee ever hired by the company. Birchall would go on to be one of the leading names in the development of multi-channel and pay television in Britain. In fact, he already was, even in 1988, having been there almost from before the beginning with the likes of Rediffusion Cablevision and the prehistoric Thorny MI cable network. One channel in particular from here, the original movie channel Premiere, stood Birchall in good stead to manage Screen. As if to prove it, Premiere promptly collapsed after his departure, and while there's almost certainly no direct connection, it's still a neat metaphor. On moving to BSB, Birchall found himself not just a channel controller, but a general in what had become a full-fledged war with Sky. The Robert E. Lee to his Ulysses S. Grant would be the doleful Stuart Till, who these days is chairman and chief executive of colossal distribution middlemen United International Pictures. What Birchall understood instinctively was that, at least before Sky Movies came along, the Screen Channel's main competition wasn't going to be any other TV station, but that second front, the direct VHS market. As soon as a movie premiered on take-home repeat viewing home video, its market value crashed like pumpkin futures in November. The key was clearly to haul a movie's Screen Channel premiere as close as possible to their original theatrical release. Industry policy at the time was for a window of 12 months between theatrical release and debut on video, and then another 12 months before the movie would premiere on pay TV, and then another 12 months before debuting on puffy old steam-powered terrestrial television. Birchall's initial dream was for movies to debut on BSB simultaneously with their appearance on video. But that was the pipiest of dreams, and he knew it. So instead, he lobbied for the window between VHS and pay TV to be shrunk to 6 months, commissioning an exhaustive, almost forensic report into the rental market to back him up. This research demonstrated the seemingly obvious point that demand inevitably peaked in the first fortnight after a movie's release, and then dropped off almost completely afterward. Obviously, this wasn't any great surprise. The value of an unseen movie is inevitably almost infinitely greater than that of a seen one. The studios thanked BSB for their research, but it was all in vain, as the video companies had them by the balls, in not dissimilar fashion to how the studios had BSB by the balls. Because by now, most of the studios were making a hefty chunk of their money via video sales, more than they were making from cinema release alone, and often only slightly less than from the TV rights. Suddenly, the video companies were a massive source of revenue, and as such, the studios couldn't afford to even mildly irritate them, and so Birchall and BSB were reduced to banging their heads against a brick wall. It was at roughly this point that Murdoch showed up, and as he so often did, he had a head start. BSB were making very little headway with the major studios, but he was one of the major studios. The chances of anything from the Fox stable appearing on BSB suddenly plummeted to absolute zero, and that included blockbuster material like the Alien and Predator films. Not to mention a certain science fiction series which Fox didn't make, but they owned the distribution rights to. Murdoch's ownership of Fox also made him a known quantity in Hollywood. He'd been everywhere before, he'd met everyone before. He knew the language, he knew the setting, he was a mogul amongst moguls. Although this actually also added up to a very slight disadvantage for Murdoch, because while everyone knew him, no one liked him, which would seem to be a natural consequence of knowing him. More specifically, no one in Tinseltown trusted him further than they could throw the Hollywood sign, IBID. And they certainly didn't trust his movie channel. BSB's plans for Screen matched the profile of American cable networks, in that it was going to be subscription-based. While the other two channels, and Screen itself in the mornings when Zigzag had the airspace, would be free to air, minus the cost of the dish and box, viewers would have to pay an extra £2.50 a month for the movies, in glorious widescreen DMAC of course. Or what would be widescreen if there were any widescreen televisions yet. Anyone else would just get Lego soup and an error message. Sky were going to work differently. They were using old-fashioned PAL for a start, which no one had figured out how to encrypt yet. So their movie channel was going to have to be completely free to air, available to any old muppet with the appropriate dish, potentially sending the value of movie premieres on the service crashing to the basement. On top of that, being unscrambled and unencrypted, it was going to be chock full of adverts. And Hollywood really hated the idea of adverts interrupting their products, as opposed to being ambiently sewn into them.
I go out and I get myself a Pepsi-Cola.
Wow, a Pepsi-Cola.
Yeah, you know, it's the choice of a new generation.
Adverts they couldn't control or, more importantly, profit from. They chafed against it. Obviously they accepted it as a fact of life on regular commercial television in America and elsewhere. But the whole point of pay TV was to provide an escape from that sort of thing. The ability to show movies, and indeed anything else, uninterrupted by profound messages on stomach aches and the like, was one of the main selling points of pay TV in America in the first place. What was worse, Sky was unregulated. No rules, no rulers, nothing stopping them from doing whatever they liked. They could show 8 commercial breaks an hour if they'd wanted. There was nothing the studios could have done about it. At one point they insisted that Sky could only show films if they'd already been on television so often that no one really cared anymore. Which of course defeats the purpose of even having a purpose in the first place. But of course Murdoch and Sky were already working on it. Unfortunately for him, and very unfortunately for BSB, they eventually made their breakthrough. Canal Plus, France's answer to Channel 4, had been encrypted since the year dot by a smart card. Like most of Sky's equipment, it was less sophisticated than BSB's, but much cheaper. Although Canal Plus, being French and proprietary, used CCAM rather than PAL, parce que c'est mieux, the two were similar enough for Sky to reverse engineer and then adapt the technology for their use. Freed from, well, being free, Sky Movies switched to the no-ad subscription model, and suddenly the playing field was levelled again, and the studios started talking to both companies in earnest. All BSB could do was curse their own procrastinating arses for not sealing even one solitary studio deal before Sky came along. Not only were BSB in a war, they were up against an enemy powerful enough to set the rules of engagement. In this case, that meant ruthlessly redefining the terms of negotiation between Hollywood and the satellite companies. BSB had been banking on using a sort of pay-as-you-go system, forking out the cash only after the movies had been actually screened, in the happy operating future in which, please God, they were actually making money as well as spending it. Borrowing momentum from the future, in other words. Not entirely unlike how the credit crunch happened. But then the Hollywood veteran Murdoch showed up and introduced the notion of paying up front and contractual guarantees, and the price tags started to bloat. The next few months were not high points for the personal dignity of anyone involved, but especially the likes of Birchall, ASG, Graham Grist, and Virgin's ambassador to BSB, Robert Devereux. For them, this period was essentially an extended, nightmarish episode of Dragon's Den. All of them, at some time or another, found themselves grovelling like medieval peasants in front of stone-faced Hollywood moguls, or audibly tooth-grinding investors, either trying to make progress on the film rights, or desperately trying to convince the increasingly dubious shareholders to hurl fistfuls of cash into the company, feverishly promising they'd definitely see it all again someday if you just invest now, please God. Meanwhile, Sky were sweating blood almost as profusely, despite already having the Fox library sewn up. Even Rupert's resources weren't inexhaustible, and there was still that thing where his contemporaries didn't trust him an attometer. The Battle of Hollywood raged on for months, and ended with both sides lying bloodied on the battlefield, listlessly claiming victory. BSB had come away with more studios in their corner, but for a truly colossal outlay. Paramount and Universal alone had gone for a combined total of $200 million, with a further $83 million spent on securing Columbia TriStar, and $50 million on MGM UA, who had insisted on an ITC-style blind auction complete with sealed envelopes, which shattered the last nerve of all concerned. Sky had spent $100 million on a Disney contract, which didn't seem as good a capture in 1988 as it does now, despite including its subsidiaries such as Touchstone, but then that was about to change. They'd also secured mini-major Orion, which meant the likes of RoboCop and Platoon. But the big capture for Sky, the one that really kept Sky Movies afloat, was Warner's. They had been right on the point of throwing in with BSB, but on the day the deal was agreed in principle, the $200 million deal with Paramount was also due to go through, and with the shareholders absolutely refusing to budge from their self-drawn maximum, it was clear they could have one or the other, but not both. ASG chose Paramount, and Warner's went to Sky instead. Of course, Murdoch could have told the shareholders to eat a punnet of koala droppings, but no one at BSB had that kind of power or resources. If they had, if BSB had managed to capture Warner's as well as all the others, then Sky Movies would have looked very, very thin indeed. The eventual assessment in the papers was that BSB had narrowly won. Well, except in the Sun today and the Times, of course, where they didn't even acknowledge their existence. But in truth, it was a score draw at best. Both companies had taken heavy damage in the process, with the Hollywood studios gleefully taking advantage of the fact that they held all the cards to charge truly psychotic fees. BSB may have got the most signatures, but they arguably suffered the worst damage. Altogether, something like $1.2 billion was spent between the two companies, with BSB putting up the vast majority, $700 million of it. Then at the end of 1988, the film war claimed a major casualty. Having watched as BSB were outmanoeuvred at every turn by the more experienced Murdoch, and having spent the lion's share of $1.25 billion on what amounted to a set of promises, Richard Devereaux was starting to itch, as was his brother-in-law, Richard Branson. Virgin, one of the original consortium that formed BSB, was pulling out. It was withdrawing from the public sector altogether, Branson explained, and the timing was entirely coincidental. Chinny reckon. BSB had started to look ominously like a money pit. It was always a given that the company would be balls expensive to set up, such that it wouldn't turn a profit for a good 5 years. But as far as Branson was concerned, it had already gone beyond balls expensive to cover the majority of the male reproductive system. And they hadn't even launched their pricey satellite yet. It was looking, and not just to Branson, as if BSB may never turn a profit at all. And so in December, BSB lost another founder. It was little consolation that, unlike Amstrad, Virgin didn't immediately defect to the other side. Instead, they sold their stake wholesale to Alan Bond and left the stock exchange altogether. Temporarily, of course. More consoling was the fact that by then BSB had launched their pricey satellite. Marco Polo 1 had taken off in August 1989, shortly after the movie war ended. BSB had made it into space. Now they had to make it back to Earth. And that was the hard part.